today, you will have that in the chat. So we're going to push that out afterwards. I can't promise when, but after. We are pleased to have Mira, once she is able to join us, open up, and she will share some work that I'm sending all of our presenters with her unequal profession. I feel like I'm almost a product spokesperson, right? Like I'm showing her book. But it's phenomenal research that she's been working on for a while. And we're also pleased to have our friend Gwilym from London in lockdown, so he could tell us how to do lockdown well for the Americans who can't seem to just wear a mask. But but he is surviving his lockdown. And then Kristen Sunday, who is like presenting in 2 different virtual formats today, so she's really earning her money, but she will share with us. Ooh, Sabo, I will get you a book. Send me a DM or an email, but we'll get you a copy of the book. I'm assuming you can get a copy through Amazon, but I don't know. You can get everything through Amazon. Oh, Kristen, you are here now. Awesome. I love it. Yay. Well, I'm glad your talk went well, so we'll put a heart over that comment. Poor Mira. I don't know what to say about the technical difficulties. How's everybody enjoying the snacks? What snacks? Whatever you found in your refrigerator. Yes. You can get a copy from Stanford Press. Thank you, Jen Romig. Yes, Jen Romig is a huge fan of this work. I don't know how those academic press publications. I actually bought mine in Amazon, so sorry. I will just say use Amazon as we're using them for everything else. Say, Amy, any
I sent her the link again, so hopefully it works for her.
Okay. How about this, in the interest of time, because I think there'll be lots of questions from our 3 presenters. Kristen Sunday, are you ready to report out?
Yes, ma'am, I can go for sure.
All right. I told you we'll manage, so we'll just kind of flip the script just a little bit again. And I'll text Mira to see if she needs me to share something in an email with her. Hi, how'd it go with your other talk? Well?
Oh, it's great. Thank you. Yeah, I was just chatting with the Legal Services Corporation about some legal aid projects that we're working on. So, yeah, keeping it in the justice tech family here.
Excellent. All right. So I'll do a sort of like crazy short, brief intro to Kristen Sunday. Kristen is an amazing legal tech founder and lawyer out of Chicago. And she's co-founder of Paladin, which is a sort of company that helps law firms with their pro bono, sort of managing their pro bono work. Yes? Is that fair?
Yes, great.
Okay. And you've been doing some research on the diversity in the legal tech space in terms of founders of color, and women. And this report that you recently published is like part 2 from part 1, right? Okay. So
Exactly.
tell us about part 2. Tell us about part 1 and part 2, really, and what you learned in your work. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And also, feel free to jump in at any point with questions or thoughts. As Nicole alluded to, so I'm one of the co-founders at Paladin, and our mission is to increase access to justice by helping legal teams run more efficient pro bono programs. I'm also one of 4 Latina founders in legal tech, which is crazy, and one of about 17 Latinx founders overall. So my goal for this session is really threefold. The first is to share a little bit of context in terms of where we are as an industry around diversity in legal tech. The second is to talk about why all this matters. And the third is to share some tips and recommendations in terms of where do we go from here and what we can do to support diverse founders and also increase diversity within legal tech. So Just to provide a little bit of background, as Nicole mentioned, back in 2017, and we launched Paladin in 2016, there was a journalist who dubbed 2017 kind of the year of the woman in legal tech. There were a couple big acquisitions, some funding, some big hires, but when I looked around, that story was quite different than what I was seeing as a relatively new legal tech founder in the industry. So I wanted to understand from a data-driven perspective, like, who were the other legal tech founders, what were they working on, and who else was in the scene that looked like me, where I could learn what their journeys had been like. So when I asked around, no one had data around diversity in legal tech, so I did probably what any other entrepreneur would do and decided to just create a data set of my own. It took about 6 months, and I compiled a list of over 1,000 companies from a variety of sources, ended up whittling it down to 269 legal tech companies that were US-based, full-time, focused solely on legal or primarily on legal. And I wanted to understand the different backgrounds of all their founders. So overall, I ended up studying 478 founders, looking at things like their racial and ethnic backgrounds, their gender, whether or not they had a JD, where they were located, what they were working on, to really get a pointillistic picture of who was working on what across the industry. I was pretty surprised to find that diversity in legal tech was quite low, although maybe not surprising when we look at the numbers in legal overall, as we were doing this morning, and thinking about tech in general. But women made up about 13.8% of founders, and diverse founders made up about 26.5%. Drilling down a little bit, Black founders made up 2.3%, and Latino founders made up 3.1%. This was a couple of years ago. So really we're looking at like Black and Latinx representation to be about 5% of folks in legal tech. That was incredibly disappointing to me for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously half of our population is a woman, and women now outnumber men in law school. And then when we look to the shift in consumer diversity over the next few decades, and think about how we are going to be majority minority by the decade 2040, it was really important to me to understand, why we didn't have those voices and those faces represented in the legal tech community, and really seek to understand what we could do about it. So that's where we were. And then, of course, with all the events of last summer, George Floyd's death, among others, it was exciting to see a renewed conversation and renewed commitment to racial equity and racial justice, especially within legal and legal tech. Whether or not folks follow through with those commitments is something that I'm very excited to see how it plays out. But I think it was definitely a good step in at least having those commitments to make change and putting some money and resources behind actually helping the founders and other diverse folks within the industry. So with that as the backdrop, I decided to do a refresh of this study last fall, and I was working with the Stanford Codex team and Pieter Gunst in particular from Legal.io, and I wanted to drive home the question of who's driving innovation and progress in our industry now, so looking at the last 10 years specifically, as we look at kind of standalone, full-time legal tech companies based in the US. So all in this time around, this was a few months ago, we examined 392 founders across 219 companies. And the synthesis is that we are making gains, but they are very, very slow. So to provide a bit of background in terms of where we are now, we actually saw a slight decrease in the number of founders of color, very slight, down from 127 to 124. And then we also saw a decrease in the number of female founders from 66 to 57. So while those numbers are still pretty small, they actually do represent a slight increase in the percentage of new founders. Diverse founders went from representing 26.5 to 31.6%, and then women went from representing 13.8% to 14.5%. Again, very, very small increases, but we're trending in the right direction nonetheless, so that's definitely exciting. There were 9 Black and Latinx-led companies that fell off the last list for either being greater than 10 years old, so like Rocket Lawyer, some got acquired, so Aide Soto from Simple Citizen was a great example, or they shut down like the Dealer Whip team. But even though we lost 9, we gained 13, working on issues primarily around access to justice, so thinking about companies like Athena, Justice Text, People Clerk, and also focusing on new marketplaces, so companies like Anu, Lista Legal, Freelance for Law, among others. So overall, these moves represent a bump in Black founders from 2.3 to 3.3%, and Latinx founders from 3.1 to 4.3%. Again, tiny numbers, but at least they're trending in the right direction. Okay, so that's a little bit about where we are. Now, I wanted to share a bit about why this matters, because there's been a lot of studies done around this, but primarily in my mind, like the whole goal of legal technology is to make the law more accessible and easier to navigate both for lawyers and individual clients, right? And especially given the justice gap and how dire it is when we think about how 86% of low-income individuals' civil legal needs are not met by the existing system, and that gap disproportionately affects women, immigrants, and minorities. It is crucial that those experiences and those voices are included in the development process to help address a lot of the needs that the existing system leaves out. In addition, diverse leaders are, of course, going to raise issues that others wouldn't consider. They're going to bring on more diverse teams and contribute more diverse and well-rounded viewpoints to create a superior product. And they also statistically are going to drive better financial returns. So there are a number of studies that demonstrate that female founders and diverse-led teams end up producing greater ROI from an investment perspective. Just firsthand, I can say we're expected to do a lot more with a lot less invested, so you're definitely going to find a scrappy team there. And then lastly, as the consumer base does become more diverse, as I mentioned, I think it's important to have these voices included in product development, especially since they're going to be using these tools to solve really crucial legal issues. Okay, so what we can do about this serious issue, and Greg, thank you for pointing that out, because I do have some recommendations. He's asking if there are any legal tech reporters and bloggers in the audience, because I do have some very specific recommendations for folks in the audience in terms of how you can help. Because I think when we talk about what can we do as a collective industry to help, that's not really getting to the heart of the problem, and it kind of puts the burden on other people. And there are very specific things that each one of us can do, and even by showing up here and entertaining this conversation, that's really a fantastic first step. So I did want to highlight a few things that we can literally do today to help this cause move forward. So there's basically 7 things that I want to lay out. First, in terms of high-level goals, I wanted to highlight why I think that we need to first make the current group of diverse founders as successful as possible to help further the cause longer term. Number one, I think we need to change the pattern recognition of what success looks like to both investors and buyers, right? So investors tend to invest in other folks who look like them, which is also why less than 3% of VC funds go to women, less than 1% of VC funds go to Black and Latinx founders. And that also translates to buyers, right? And people who are hiring managers. You want to work with people who feel familiar. So you're typically going to invest or buy or hire people who look like you. So we definitely need to change the face of what success looks like. The second is that by working with this existing cohort of founders, we're going to inspire others to start companies sheerly by visualizing what representation looks like. I believe, especially as a first-gen Latina founder myself, that you can't be what you can't see. And so presenting founders who do look diverse and who are more reflective of the demographics of this country, we're going to inspire and encourage others to get involved who might not have gotten involved before. And lastly, we have the opportunity to increase investment in others by creating generational wealth. So one really great example here is Janine Sickmeyer. She built Nsf Chapter, sold it to Fastcase, and now she's an angel investor in other female-founded and diverse-founded companies, both inside and outside of legal tech. But she's a really great example of how we can reinvest those successes. So in terms of where we explicitly start, because I always like to be very tangible in takeaways here, I have seven thoughts for folks depending on where you are in the audience. The first is that if you can be a client, buy their products. I know there are some decision makers on this call, and by even just giving folks a fair look at what their products do and how they might impact your firm, that's a really great first step in getting new business to people who wouldn't have access to those networks otherwise. The second is that if you can invest, to write a check. So some of Paladin's earliest investors were people in our network who wrote 5 or 10K checks. Obviously, not everyone is in a position to do that. So if you are, even those 5 and 10K checks go far early on for early stage companies that are putting together very small rounds to help them get their prototype or their MVP off the ground, and just allow them a little bit of breathing room, especially if they're recent grads or just starting out, to really try out their product in the market and see what product market fit could look like. The third is around decision makers. So if you know a decision maker at a firm, just making an introduction is so invaluable. I had, there's this one lawyer at a firm, he runs a VC / law networking group, and I've never met him before, but I've engaged with some of his content online and through webinars, and I just shot him a note asking if he'd introduce me to the pro bono counsel at his respective firm, and without question he made the intro later that day, and now we're having a productive dialogue about whether that firm would be a good fit for Paladin. And just even, I didn't know anyone at that firm before, but just networking and asking for that intro, even though we've never met, has been game changing in terms of whether or not we could gain a new client and further the business. So that's been really, really helpful. Number 4, if you're on social media, just share or like these companies' posts. So super easy, maybe don't do it when other people are talking, but you can definitely do it while I'm talking. Just go on Twitter right now and give Nicole a shout out, or give one of these speakers a shout out. It really helps amplify our messages and celebrates their contributions to the industry in a way they might not get attention otherwise, especially because we don't have access to the same networks. Number 5, if you're a journalist, and Julie, thank you for being here and for covering this, and also for interviewing me in a recent article. Would definitely encourage folks to write about or interview diverse founders. Again, we want to highlight their expertise and make sure we amplify their voice and increase visibility. Again, so we can really change the face of what success looks like here. Number 6, if you're hosting a conference, invite them to speak. Thank you, Nicole, for giving us all a platform here to share what we're working on, how we're thinking about things. I also love when folks ask me to speak about things other than diversity, because we get to talk about our expertise and really establish ourselves as subject matter experts. So we're not pigeonholed, but it's really nice to have that platform. So thank you for that. And then lastly, if you work at a law school, again, thank you. Invite diverse folks to present to students, again, so we can really change the face of what this looks like and make introductions and create networks where they wouldn't exist otherwise. So those are a few tangible steps that I hope are helpful to support diverse founders. And personally, I found each of them to be really game-changing in my journey as a founder. And I, in turn, look to amplify others now that I do have a platform. So for example, I was hosting a column on Thomson Reuters Legal Executive Institute on access to justice tech, and over 50% of the folks that I would interview in my articles were diverse or were female founders. And it's really important for us to constantly be giving back and just creating that feedback loop so we can elevate each other. All right, the second part of advocacy that I would recommend is to encourage more diverse budding entrepreneurs to get into legal tech, or really just get into tech, period, so they can learn about what's involved. So Paladin's actually my second startup. My first one, I joined the founding team. I was employee number 2 of a company called Grouper in New York back in 2012, which we took through Y Combinator. We scaled internationally. We raised a couple $1 million from well-known VCs on the coast. And that's really where I learned how to build a startup from the ground up, and then was able to leverage that knowledge and expertise for Paladin many years later, taking it through a different accelerator, Techstars, growing domestically, raising millions from VCs, et cetera. So getting that experience on the ground, not necessarily as a founder, has been really instrumental. And to the extent that we can encourage folks to try it out and get involved, that I think is a fantastic stepping stone to actually becoming a founder and getting into legal tech. And then whether you are at a firm or in-house or at a law school, you can do other things like expose your team to legal tech companies, host innovative speakers, encourage students to try externships or internships within legal tech or just tech in general, again, to get that exposure. Promoting demo days and pitch nights. So Duke's Law Lab has a really great accelerator program that I highly recommend everyone check out. because they have fantastic companies and a really great mindset around innovation. So again, that exposure is just so important. There was nothing like that when we were starting Paladin, and I wish I had had those avenues to understand what other people were doing in the field and understand what resources were available to help us along the way. And then lastly, sharing relevant content that might inspire them, I found to be really helpful as well on both sides. So 2 last notes, and then would love to open it up for folks' feedback and questions. The first is that oftentimes support for diverse founders comes from people who don't look like us. So it's really important to find allies who can open those doors, again, make those intros. Maybe they have the buying power, the decision-making power that that folks who look like us don't have. And that lifeline is really essential to getting in front of people and getting your product in the door in a way that few other networks provide. So definitely advocate for all the allies on the call to open your DMs and your messages and your inboxes to us and give kind of a fair look to folks who wouldn't be able to reach you otherwise. That's super important. And then the last note that I just want to end on is that it's also up to us as founders to responsibly build scalable, sustainable, and if we want it, VC backable big businesses that warrant all the things that I just recommended. We shouldn't assume that just because we're diverse founders, we're going to gain access to all these networks or these programs, et cetera. We also have to put in the work and do our research and contribute to the industry and build a solid product that people want to use and test it out. So it definitely goes both ways. And I want to make sure that founders understand, it's a really difficult journey, and you end up like eating and sleeping and living and breathing the problem that you're trying to solve. So you have to really love it, and then the rest, everything else will follow from there. But yeah, it's a very difficult journey enough as a founder, and then of course coming from a background where you don't have access to the same networks or capital as other folks adds a layer of complexity that's pretty tricky. But the good news is that there are an increasing group of diverse founders within legal tech specifically, and I found the community to be incredibly open-minded and supportive. So at any point, I'm always happy to be a resource, and I know there are others in the space as well who will open their doors. So definitely reach out if folks are thinking about it. I don't know if someone posted this, they might have. I wrote that update in Medium, or I'll post it in a bit, a few weeks ago that has a list of other, maybe a dozen or so other Black and brown founders in particular in legal tech. So there'll be a resource for folks on the call to reach out to as well.
I shared it in the chat, Kristen.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so I hope that was helpful just in terms of where we are and kind of where we can go. I'll just peruse quickly. Greg says, I've noticed the big legal tech reporters go to the usual suspects and usual conferences, talk with usual suspects, don't make an effort. Yeah, so that's actually something I've been trying to change. Sometimes I get into a little bit of Twitter heat about this, but I do seek to provide a database of, at this point we have over 70 female founders over the past few years that I share out with folks. We're getting better at kind of calling people out when they don't have diverse panels. And one thing, actually this is a really great recommendation, Greg, is when I'm asked to speak or when others, usual suspects, are asked to speak, I always try to give a recommendation or two for other people that don't speak as often so that they get those connections and exposure to people. So that's another great way, when you're asked to speak or someone at the firm is, to just say, yeah, we can totally do it, but also have you met these other people? Can I make an intro? They're doing something really interesting. That's a nice way to kind of scale the network effect. Julie, a Black legal tech journalist, she tries to do as much as she can to search out other diverse voices, cover usual conferences. Great. Yeah, you do a really great job of this, Julie. Kudos to you. And I think we connected over Twitter, actually. So just being visible even on Twitter has been fantastic in helping spread the word. Evan, how does one find companies looking for funds? Legal tech startups we hear about have gone through a round or two. I must admit, I'm often at the usual conferences. Great question. I will send you an email after this. There at the ABA Tech Show, there's a great, I think they call it Startup Alley, where they showcase about a dozen or two new up-and-coming legal tech companies that you should definitely check out. And there are also a number of legal-specific VCs that are focused on early-stage legal tech companies, so can send some resources your way as well. don't want to take up too much time, so I will stop there, but definitely welcome any other thoughts and questions as we go. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to chat with people. So thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. Yay, that was phenomenal. I just heart you. At some point, Dorna from Documate is gonna like drop in. I think she's either within the last hour, so I'm gonna look for her on the participant list because I think she can also share some similar stories. And when we talk about achieving resource equity, all of your comments are so helpful. I think there was a question earlier, but your article I shared hopefully can resonate with some people wanting to know more about the stats. But we'll loop back because we've got another presenter. Mira, I'm so sorry you had trouble getting in. Can you hear? Can you talk? Mira, there she is. At least there's her phone. I know you've got a different handle. So Amy, I don't know if you're helping solve some tech issues for Mira.
I have her unmuted, so I got,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, this hopefully is working.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yay, okay, perfect.
There you are. Welcome.
I'm so sorry, everyone, about the tech issues, and I'm so grateful to be here. I think because we've had so many challenges today, you guys do have my slides. So if you wouldn't mind sharing those from your end, I think that would, I just don't want a chance doing anything else.
No problem.
Difficult.
I gave them to Amy, so that way. Yes.
Perfect. So I am just thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you all. And I want to thank the organizers, especially for inviting me here to share my original research with you. I'm presenting findings from my book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, which was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press. Next slide. So here's a brief outline of what I'm hoping to cover in my 15 minutes or so of presentation time. We'll start with some facts and figures, and then I'll introduce details about diversity in legal education. We'll start with law students, since that's pretty familiar, and we'll talk about faculty as well. And then we'll move on to discuss the actual findings from my book with a focus on hiring as well as retention. And we'll cover a couple different themes that I think will be familiar to many of you and that will resonate even with people who are far outside of academia. And then hopefully I can jumpstart some of our discussion with solutions. Next slide. So first, some bad news. There are very few law faculty of color in the United States. Of the roughly 11,000 law professors, 62% are men and at least 71% are white. As a whole, there are just 771 women of color, and this comprises about 7% of the total. The total for men of color is just slightly higher at about 8%. Next slide, please. So here's another way of showing the same data. Here, you can see that most groups are pretty invisible. White men are very well represented. White women are pretty well represented. Next slide. Here's another way of showing the data as well. Here I had to lump together different groups. So the group that I'll be spending most of my time today talking about is that light green slice, women of color. Men of color are that dark green slice. Next slide. So the National Association of Law Placement also collects data each year for practicing lawyers. And so just to make clear that what I'm talking about for faculty members is directly relevant and applicable for practicing attorneys as well, you can see what the numbers are for law firm associates here. There's actually been very little change over the last 5 years. And it's relatively similar, as you know, from the previous slide, to what we see in legal academia. Remember, though, that this is for associates. So what do you think the next slide is? You can move ahead. Partners. So here are the data for partners. There has been some progress at the partnership level, most specifically for white women, and there's actually been very little change for men of color and for women of color in that time. So most of what you'll see me present on legal academics will be applicable in very similar ways to practitioners in law firm life as well. Next slide. So shockingly, very few have studied diversity among law faculty. I've listed here just a few related works. Given the paucity of people studying this topic, you might wonder if it is important at all. Next slide. There is much more of a focus on law student diversity, including data from the Law School Survey of Student Engagement. So LESI conducts an annual survey in partnership with participating law schools, and we gather data from law students on everything from the ways in which they use their time to the quality of their interactions with faculty, staff, and classmates. And then we publish that data in informal blog posts and formal reports. We work with individual schools and with partner academics to improve legal education as a whole. Next slide. So we found, for instance, that the vast majority of students believe their instructors care about their success and learning in law school and that they have positive relationships with faculty members. Next slide. We've looked into the success of women students, revealing that their significant achievements come at great personal cost, including really high levels of law school loans and very little sleep for the time that they're in law school. Next slide. Our most recent annual report revealed that the most privileged students are actually those who appreciate their institutional diversity efforts on campus. Those who have the most to lose, so these are students of color, students who are women, first-gen students, LGBTQ students, those who have the highest debt levels, these tend to be much less satisfied with various diversity efforts on campus. Next slide. All right, so why then think about faculty diversity? Well, exposure to diversity, we know, improves students' critical thinking, it increases their overall satisfaction with law school, and it enhances leadership skills. So when we have diversity, not just among students who are sitting together in a classroom, but even with regard to those who are behind the podium at the front of the classroom, opportunities for exposure to diverse ideas increase even further. Next slide. So with this in mind, I created the Diversity in Legal Academia project, collecting survey and interview data from law faculty around the country. Ultimately, I talked with almost 100 law faculty members, and this includes 63 women of color. These are women from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, including Black, Latina, Asian American, Native American, Middle Eastern, and multiracial women. I also talked with 30 individuals from control groups. And these are people who are white women, white men, as well as men of color. And this gave me an opportunity to provide some comparisons and contrasts, including some we'll refer to today. So when making these presentations to legal academics or practitioners, I tend to kind of quickly go through the data collection and analysis and jump straight into the findings. I will say that I followed a novel target sampling approach, and I'm utilizing Stata and Atlas for quantitative and qualitative analysis. The sociologist in me actually loves talking about data collection and methods, so if anyone's interested in understanding that better, I'm happy to talk with you during the Q&A or after the presentation. Next slide. So first, though, we'll talk through the actual barriers to entry. And these are the challenges just getting your foot in the door, which Kristen really helped us understand better as well. So for this slide, there are a number of different quotes that will come up, and so I'll just cue you, Amy, through adding those. So you can put up 1 and 2. Many current law professors of color call themselves accidental law professors. So these are people who were not on a clear path to the profession, but they moved often from practicing adjuncts to visitors, ultimately to tenure track faculty members. A lot of them had to be encouraged multiple times to even consider throwing their hat in the ring before they finally were willing to try it out. Many didn't think they had the right credentials, and they had never really considered themselves in that role. All right, you can put up the next 4, please. In addition, there is outright discrimination, especially notably against Muslim and Arab Americans. And so the quote at the top in blue, for example, refers to a faculty candidate in hijab. Who, you know, the people she was trying to join, at least one of them said they just wouldn't be comfortable with her, and that was reason enough for her to not be hired. In addition to the overt discrimination, it's much more common to have more implicit biases and hidden challenges that prevent women of color from joining legal academia. There are, for example, the tendency for predominantly white male institutions to reproduce themselves by hiring other white males with whom they are most comfortable. So you can put up the next 3 on this particular slide, and then we'll move to the next one. All right, you can move ahead to the next slide. So the second thing I want to focus on today are challenges with regard to retention. And so once they begin, of course, you can put up number 1, they realize the pervasive nature of race times gender bias in legal academia. This particular quote is what I refer in the book to as heap eating. This, as well as mansplaining, are 2 of the most common reports from women of color as well as white women. Number 2, many women noted, as an Asian American does here, that their work was not valued. This creates a challenging climate to work in, as well as obstacles on the path for tenure and promotion. Number 3, for those like a Latina named Armida who write on issues involving identity, family, critical race theory, queer theory, privilege, and other topics that women of color are often drawn to study, their work is sometimes seen as purely personal and therefore not professional. Number 4, there are also intersectional barriers to leadership. Some say overtly, as Melissa, a Native American, says here, that she would never want to be a dean. Number 5, others, like an Asian American named Cindy here, internalize their colleagues' perceptions of them as leaders, deciding to opt out of their future potential. Next. In addition, there's significant work performed in terms of student challenges. A lot of women of color really enjoy doing student work, but they do probably perform more than what others do. Next. And this can have really serious challenges, especially with regard to student evaluations, which we'll talk about in a moment, and which can really stymie future opportunities for women of color faculty. Next slide. All right, I also want to just briefly highlight a couple particular themes. The first one is one that might be familiar to some of you in the audience, and this is the presumption of incompetence. Most women of color faculty experience pushback from students in class in some form or another, especially early in their careers. So as a multiracial professor named Emma explains, they don't necessarily appreciate someone in my position as a new professor, as a woman, and as a person of color. And so she gets a lot of pushback. So this is the quote that you see here. The distrust and hostility carries through to student evaluations, which tend to focus on the style of the professor over the substance of her teaching or her pedagogical approach. Number 2, so most of the women in my study talk about how their evaluations include comments about their personal physical appearance, and they're also more overt biased comments like the one here about June, a Black woman. Many women turn to mentors and fellow faculty members for help, but colleagues don't always make things better. So Alicia, a Latina, remembers, quote, "My first semester teaching, I had a very hostile student who went and complained to another faculty member. This white male colleague, number 3, as you can see, assumed that, of course, the student was correct and took his side, which created further complications for Alicia. A white male professor was hired at the same time as an Asian American in my study, and she recalls, quote, "There was a major difference in how he was treated and how I was treated." So if you look at the next quote, you'll see that she was treated like an affirmative action hire in the worst sense of the word, someone who was hired just to fill some slot in terms of her race and gender. Ironically, as it turned out, she outperformed her colleagues' expectations and the white male hire fell flat. Next slide. The second theme that I want to just quickly cover deals with how women as a whole, and especially women of color, are expected to be caretakers in academia. Number 1, Jordan, a white woman, notes that her faculty of color colleagues are expected to do more than everyone else. She sees this happening. Frequently, women of color enjoy service work. Number 2, so this is from Laura, a Native American woman who says something that was probably the most common response when I asked people what they love about their jobs. Almost everybody talked about the students. Number 3, however, women can be inundated with student requests, as Ava, a white woman, is here. And of course, this comes at a cost. Working constantly on service work leaves little time for the research and publications that are really recognized and rewarded as the primary currency at most schools. And it's not always a plus to be appointed to more service. Carla, a Latina, recalls when over the summer an administrator called her and said, quote, "You can't go on research leave this fall. You have to chair a particular committee." And so I asked her, were you flattered that they really needed you in this job? And this was her response: "I've been in this long enough to know that it's not really a compliment. It means someone needs to stay and clean the house, and it's going to be you." Next slide. So just briefly, I want to mention some comparisons and contrasts. Non-traditional faculty members face an uphill battle because students come into class expecting that sort of white male paper chase professor. When someone else is in the front of the room, they might be thrown for a loop. So you can put up the next three or four is fine. So these are all examples from white men in my sample who talk about the ways in which the students are really generous with them, that sometimes they're getting better evaluation scores and comments than they might expect, and then they might feel as if they deserve. Next quote. And then one more. So this last one that's on this slide is from a Black man in my study. I just want to make sure that we think broadly about race times gender and the ways in which it affects men of color as well. So there are racial biases noted in the evaluations of women, but it comes across in different ways for men of color. So this is from a Black man named Ryan, who said there was a woman who wrote that she was a woman and she was afraid of him in the classroom, drawing on these notions of criminality and Black male stereotypes. All right, so I just want to end on solutions. So again here, you can start with the first one. Aisha, an Asian American, had a much more common response to race times gender bias than I expected when I first began this research, and that was to fight, to hire, in her words, the scariest lawyer and fight her way through. This was for her promotion process, so it made her tenure process actually run a lot more smoothly. 2 and 3, please. So we can recognize service and reward it with financial compensation, with a trade-off for scholarship or for teaching if women, and women of color especially, are performing so much more service work. Number 4, individuals can be proactive too. So here we have an example from Susan, a Black woman who in her own words had abysmal student evaluations, but she then invited the most highly respected faculty members at her school to sit in on her classes, and she's confident that their positive reviews ended up canceling out the student bias from evaluations. And number 5, we have to educate administrators and others about structural bias, especially affecting young women of color who are rarely seen as the authority figure. And so when we read these biased evaluations, for example, it may be helpful for us to ask ourselves, as Marisol, a Latina in my sample, suggests, what we're measuring, right? Do your evaluations suck because you suck as a teacher, or is there something else, maybe structural bias going on? All right, the overall takeaway, and you can move ahead with all 4 of the quotes on this, is to be purposeful in your hiring. Don't be strict, so strict in your hiring that nobody can get through. Don't give alibis to certain candidates that hold others back. Don't create false narratives that end up bolstering the candidate who might seem like a good fit at the expense of someone who is a little bit different. And most importantly, if you want diversity, hire diverse faculty. Go out of your way to find them. Don't just crack the door open and hope the right person falls in. I've been telling people, I've been doing a lot of consulting with law schools over the last year, and especially since last June, in the wake of the George Floyd protests. And I've been telling people directly, if you want a different result, you're going to have to go about it in a different way. So it is high time for us to change some of these processes. Last slide. You can find more information from the Diversity in Legal Academia study in my book. I've asked the organizers to drop a link to purchase the book with a discount code. It's my last name, DEO20, for a 20% discount. And I'm really happy to be here, and look forward to answering any questions and having a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Mira, wow. I was like not ready. not ready. I was not
Well,
ready.
you read the book and you weren't ready.
I have the book, and I'm still working my way through. But I mean, I didn't get to all those. I'm still not ready. Okay. Oh, did I put the T? I totally messed up your name, but it's DEO, not capital E necessarily. All right. Fantastic. But I want Gwilym to have a chance to talk, and I also want us all to sort of have a chance to talk about each of these presentations because it's fantastic. This is phenomenal stuff. Thank you so much for doing that research and doing that work. Gwilym.
Hello.
Yay.
Shall I get going?
I am good. How are you? And I don't see you, but I hear you.
Oh, should I am here. I can see me, so I think I'm on somewhere.
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, I propose to just have a few minutes of chat. Hopefully some space because I'm conscious that we also have the next slot coming up, and I don't want to cut into that too much. So I'll dive in if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Sure thing. So hello from lockdown London. We're on our third lockdown, so our new salutation is Happy New Lockdown when we see people. But we are properly locked down because there's nothing else to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Europe. I have to say that the themes I've been hearing throughout this amazing session are very familiar. In particular, some inspirational and energetic people trying to make changes against a very difficult backdrop. So we have a similar story over here as well. And congratulations to you for all your efforts. I'll tell you what we're seeing over here and where we are. I'll tell you a tiny bit about what I'm doing, what's happening in our firm, which is a representative of some of the activity in the UK. And I just want to stress how honoured and proud I am to be asked to speak on this amazing panel. I suspect my best classification is an ally, and I want to talk a bit about allyship very briefly, and that call to action that Nicole mentioned, because that's incredibly important. So where are we now? Gender equality has been a very strong focus for a long time. Our stats are not dissimilar to those we're seeing in the US, I think. We've still got a way to go. But we still see, I think we found a global analysis of patenting that in 2017, 69% of all patents submitted worldwide were all male. There's a breakdown of all male teams and all female teams. 25% of those were all male teams. Patents submitted by all female teams, 0.3%. So a long way to go there. I think that was a pretty chilling statistic, to be honest. On the ethnicity side, I think we haven't progressed very well, I would say, if I may. Certainly from a report in 2014 by Max Nathan, it was extremely clear that globally we're a long way off, and I think that's reflected in the UK and in Europe as well. We have a lot of data on gender stats. We're still collecting that data on the ethnicity side of things. And of course, we also need the action after that too. Final little stat, in the UK patent profession, so that's patent attorneys in the UK, is approximately 30% female. You won't be surprised to hear that, similar to some of the numbers we've just been seeing, the numbers for a partnership begin to drop notably at that stage. So what are the initiatives that we're seeing in Europe? I have to say that the United Kingdom is actually one of the more impressive offices for this. They are highly active. They're commissioning a whole bunch of studies. They're very diversity aware. We've talked a lot about gender and ethnicity diversity. Neurodiversity is also an interesting topic over here. A lot of people, I worry about saying things inappropriate, but for example, the scientific community does apparently have a greater proportion of Asperger's sufferers, and we're looking also at how we're able to make all the opportunities the same in that area. For example, there are other areas of ability as well we've been looking at too. So strong focus at the UK office. European Patent Office definitely catching up, but it knows it's got work to do. It is creating an internal network for diversity and inclusivity. Very interesting, very quick, interesting point. The language of the European patent documentation is very gender specific and not great. That is something that they're working on hard. fascinating question. It's a trilingual patent office. The other two languages are French and German, both of which are gendered languages by definition. So the EPO has a huge simple linguistic issue to deal with. But it's great to hear that they're on it. One body I really want to mention quickly in the UK is IP Inclusive, which has been a magnificently successful body. It is hugely involved in what we call the STEM subjects, really trying to enhance access and teaching in the STEM areas across a diverse background. A lot of outreach activities into schools and universities to encourage not just knowledge of the IP and legal profession, but also to encourage people to move into science subjects, which is, of course, the pool from which the whole profession draws. Loads of issues, loads of areas of mentoring, of work experience, and so on. It has a whole bunch of individual communities: IP Out, Women in IP, IP and ME, minority ethnicity, IP Ability, IP Futures. Really fascinating whole group of stuff. Very, very active. It's ipinclusive.org.uk. I'll try and type that into the chat in a moment. Wonderful to see what they're up to. A lot of support from the professions in the UK as well as individual sponsors as well. It's great what they're doing. I'm great friends with Andrea Brewster. I'm pleased to say the government awarded her an MBE recently, which is one of the awards we give out for people who are doing amazing things. Her energy is incredible. Very quickly, my firm is probably quite representative. We have a diversity forum. The one thing I'd probably focus on rather than throwing stats at you is that we have decided that we want to support diversity primarily for the simple reason that it's the right thing to do. And I think that gives a real clarity of vision. There are so many reasons underlying that. Kristen listed a whole bunch of them, but actually let's focus on just doing it because it's the sort of thing we have to do. Everything else follows on from that. And that's something I think within the profession in the UK, we've decided that's our line. It's the right thing to do. Let's push with that. And so finally, as I'm rushing through, on the role of the ally, I just want to tell one story that we did in the UK. And this is Andrea Brewster was generous enough to invite me to be involved in this, which was a senior leaders in IP think tank. We wanted to get people to go beyond saying I'm an ally, we support loads of projects and talk to our HR department for more information. We wanted people to individually say why they wanted to be involved and what they themselves could do. And that has been a real success. We had, we're not a massive profession. We had 30 individual firms and 50 people wanting to attend that. A big, I won't beat around the bush, a big white male turnout for that one. But that was great, and real energy and enthusiasm and creativity, and the desire not just to talk the talk, but actually to walk some of the walk. And so there's activity that's going forward. The beginnings of that have been very exciting. We know there's a lot more we should be doing, and we know that it's not just about paying lip service. That was my thoughts given the timings here. I hope that's been helpful. Very happy to chat in the discussion section.
Yes, thank you, Gwilym. I wanted to share with our folks on the conference or in the group today. How did we get to connect to you, right? So it was lovely in terms of your remarks, because that's exactly how we connected. You found us. Your partner, Albert Kayak, I'm saying his last name correct. I hope, attended the conference that we did in 2020 at the law school. So we were in person, and he reached out and said, "What are you doing this year?" I shared our theme, and that's how I got connected to you. And when we had our pre-call, he goes, I saw the panels, and it's okay if, I'm not appropriate because I'm just going to be the only white guy on the list. And I said, "No, you are absolutely appropriate because you actually want to participate and have a conversation and dialogue about this important topic and share and report out what you're doing at the firm, what you're doing more broadly within the UK. And you have admittedly sort of exposed a layer of vulnerability, and we need you to be an ally. Like I think in the chat, there were some comments about the usual suspects and the usual conferences. We need conversations like this one today to be spread through the ecosystem and for people to get connected in ways that we were not before. So you heard Kristen speak, and looking at legal tech founders, you might be able to make a connection to folks in the UK who are trying to support what's happening, because all of this work is global, and it's not just limited to Chicago or Atlanta or the US. So I am thrilled to have you. I appreciate what you had to share. I also appreciate what Mira and Kristen shared, and I want to open it to some Q&A. I think we can naturally flow into the achieving resource equity conversation as well, but I do want to just press pause and get questions or comments from people on the work that Mira and Kristen are reporting on, and really more of the work that you are seeing, Gwilym, and that you guys are doing with the IP Inclusive. I shared the link in the chat for people to follow up. So with that, are there questions? If not, I'll just go to my list of questions. But I had some colleagues who were excited to hear Mira your work, so yay. Oh, Greg, yes, perfect. Let's see. Greg, you're first up.
All right. Well, first of all, I wanted to correct Gwilym's clock behind him. Can I move that to the correct time? But Mira, I had a question. I had a question for you. When you do the evaluation, sometimes you see that the questions that are asked sometimes lead or may have some embedded bias within how the questions are asked. Have you seen that at all with any of the surveys or evaluation questions that you look through?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. Like I said, I love talking about methods, so appreciate the question. I am, so my background is as a lawyer, but also as a sociologist. And so I think there has been a move in legal academia, first of all, to hire more PhDs, which itself has troubling implications for broad opportunities for diversity in the profession going forward. So in the last 3 years, about 50% of all new hires, entry-level hires, have had PhDs in addition to the JD. That's a dramatic change from even 5 years, and especially from 10 years ago, and of course from before then. But what's been interesting is that even before this, most recent trend, there's been kind of an interest in empirical research generally, and so there have been more people with JDs who are sort of dabbling in empirical research, like, let me just craft a question and send it out, or 5 questions, and then I'll call it a survey. Or, I think even for me as a mixed method empiricist, even more troubling, people who are like, well, it's not even a survey, it's just, interviews. And so anybody can write questions for an interview and have these conversations. And, I certainly don't think you need a PhD in order to do empirical research. The training that I got was very helpful, but probably most helpful was working with senior scholars and mentors. So if anyone is listening and is interested in empirical research, I don't think you need to go to school to get a PhD. Just partner with an empiricist and learn the ropes from them. There certainly are surveys that I think, if they're not very carefully crafted, they definitely run the risk of embedding or promoting bias. There's plenty of research on this directly, even things like Stereotype from Claude Steele, who has found that when you prime people with particular identity characteristics that are widely known to be to result in lower test scores for certain things, like if you ask gender questions right before the math portion of the SAT, women are more likely to do poorly than if you don't ask questions about gender. So if you remind them, don't forget you're a woman, and then they think to themselves, oh yeah, women tend to not do as well in math according to society, then they actually do perform at lower levels than if you don't prime them. And so I think I've very carefully crafted my questions to avoid some of those challenges, but and the data that I've presented on today is my own data. So aside from the NALP data, which is National Association of Law Placement data, everything that I presented was data I've collected myself from law faculty members or from students through LESI. So I think the ones that we're presenting are hopefully very carefully done.
And I was thinking more on the class surveys. So if you're taking your surveys and that's what you're being evaluated on, and the students are filling out those evaluations, Has there been any research on whether or not the questions themselves tend to lead to or direct students to answer in a certain way that may show bias?
Yes, absolutely. And, as someone who cares a lot about the student voice and student perspectives, I absolutely think student evaluations can be useful. Personally, my favorite example of this is thinking carefully about what we ask our students is critical. So my favorite example of this is that I teach civil procedure, which I love to teach. And at the end of every semester, regardless of the school I've been at, there is some version of a question on the student evaluation that asks them about my mastery of the material. Now, the only thing my students know about civil procedure is what I personally have spent the last 14 weeks teaching them, and yet we expect them to determine how well I know my stuff. I think a much better question for my students would be whether I foster a respectful classroom environment, whether students feel encouraged to participate in classroom discussions, whether I bring in context that's relevant to the class, whether it deals with race, gender, LGBTQ, or other issues that help them learn the material. Students are uniquely situated to answer those kinds of questions. And so I certainly think the types of questions we ask can be really critical.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Greg. That was awesome. Speaking of students, there is a student with a question. Hola, Yenny.
Thank you, Professor Morris, for the second shout out. Professor Dio, if you don't mind me asking, what role do you think, or just from your experience and from your empirical research as a professor, how do you think the control of curriculum, what effect do you think that has on minorities versus those who aren't, professors who aren't of color? Do you feel like they have a bit more freedom with their curriculum? Or do you feel like there's a bit of a hesitance to incorporate race into things like property, which clearly need to have a discussion on race, or even IP or Civ Pro even? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking. There's been a real resurgence, and that I use that word purposefully because I think it's cyclical. There are times when people think about this a lot. And so again, we're in a time where people are thinking about the ways in which race and context broadly really matter in the curriculum. There is lots of research showing that abstract black letter law, and I teach civil procedure, so I get it. It can be hard to sort of memorize in the abstract. And when you ground it within context, it makes it come alive. It makes it a lot more exciting and interesting for students. And so there has been, I think, renewed interest in thinking about ways that we can infuse, especially the first year curriculum, with issues of identity, whether that's race, gender, or other concepts. Things that really are significant and personal to students and that help understand the material. For sure, the identity of the faculty member matters in these contexts. One of the very first law review articles I ever wrote as a faculty member looks at this question specifically using national survey and focus group data from students. I can, when I'm done speaking, I'll look for that link and post it as well. But it's called Paint by Number because, my central finding there is that you're not just sort of filling in, numbers or colors or cases, that the context itself is so critically important. And depending on who the professor is, students really respond to those comments and that context differently. So certainly, I think it is critical. In my research, I found that women faculty members and people of color, and especially women of color, were much more likely to draw on that context and introduce it for their classes, and that, if anything, students wanted it more. They really did appreciate the ways in which what I term diversity discussions can open up the law for them and make it really exciting.
So powerful. Sorry, I didn't know if I was getting interrupted. That was that comment was echoed in the chat by Kimberly Bennett. So yes, thank you for doing that, and thank you, Yenny, for the question. I want to sort of pose a question back to the last group, and then also bring in Kimberly Bennett. So it's almost like you're queuing yourself up, and Nakia, to sort of give us a lens to this achieving resource equity. And with what we heard from Gwilym, what we heard from each of you, looking at some of the gaps, right? So there's gender and racial gaps in terms of what we're seeing in the law practice, like the associates and partners within the legal tech, founders, within the academy, in terms of the faculty and who we have in the classroom. And it's so important that we have this conversation, but it's also, I think, important that we try, and Kristen, you did a great job in terms of here's what you can do next. So building off of that theme, I'd love to get your thoughts, Professor Deo or Gwilym, in terms of what can we do, and they're separate, I recognize, but just sharing your thoughts of what we can do to sort of think of next steps. So, Gwilym, with your work with the IP inclusion, is there something we can do? And there's lots of law firm folks here today to move the needle or help you all move the needle, or you can help us move the needle. And likewise, with what Mira was talking about, what can we do to help the legal education side do better and move the needle?
Thank you. I think one thing we've identified over here through the kind of data gathering we have done is that we've got to grow the pool. And the problem there is that we don't have the diversity coming through in the education system that we need, because you haven't got the qualifications, you can't even start the process. And there's loads of work being done with who is there, but how do we grow and diversify that pool? It's a huge challenge, but actually it was an area where we had a lot of discussion, both through IP Inclusive and through the think tank, about growth of that. And if I may, there's one thing, tiny example, but sometimes it's good to identify something that can work, and it excites me. You have a wonderful charity over here called the Access Project. And what it does is it pairs up underprivileged students from all different backgrounds, but with a very strong ethnicity focus, I believe, with tutors. And you pair with them once a week. This is at what we call GCSE, like 15, 16 years old to 18 years old, pre-university. You pair up with them and you teach them. So I'm doing one. I'm very proud to say I'm doing one. I'm tutoring students in physics, which is my subject, once a week. And it's a tiny little thing, but that's multiply that even in the UK by the number of patent attorneys, every one of whom's got a science degree. That's 2,700. And suddenly you have moved the needle. So it's just one tiny example. And it's partly the example itself is great, but partly you tell that to people over here and they suddenly say, all right, that's amazing. I can do that, or this other thing and this other thing. That all counts, does it? And getting that awareness that you start somewhere can be very powerful.
Perfect. There's lots of sharing in the chat. So thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Mira, thank you for sharing your article. Any thoughts on some next steps from what we can do to change the academy to better reflect what we should be doing?
Yes. So for me personally, I've been very encouraged by a project that was spearheaded by 5 Black women deans starting last year, the Law Dean's Anti-Clearinghouse Project. I'll drop a chat if someone else doesn't momentarily, but this project reminds us that it's not enough to be passively okay with diversity, or even to, vocally say we really like diversity, but being anti-racist is more about purposefully moving forward toward anti-racism, not just pushing against certain things, but actually actively moving towards a particular direction. And in the wake of the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd protests of last summer, I think a lot of schools recognized that it wasn't enough to condemn the police, that they had to actually look within as well and recognize the ways in which they themselves as institutions were contributing to inequities. And so these women came together and started this project. They outlined 5 different phases of things that schools specifically can do. I think they could be relevant to law firms or other institutions as well, because they're broad things like listening and educating oneself and doing kind of an audit of where we are and how we might do better. So I would encourage you to take a look at their resources and their suggestions so that as organizations and institutions, as projects, we can actually move in that direction. So it's more about being purposeful and moving towards anti-racism, for example, we can apply that to all isms, right? As opposed to kind of passively saying that you don't support the bad things that are happening. This is more about actively pushing against those things. That's how we make real change.
Awesome. Actually, that is actually a perfect segue because Kimberly Bennett, I'm calling you out, is next, and Nakia. Kimberly's been doing some interesting work here in Atlanta with the Atlanta Legal Tech group, and I would love for you to highlight some of that because that's exactly what you all have shifted some of your focus on in terms of racial justice issues and purposefully doing some things to address it rather than, more passively saying we don't stand for such, nonsensical behavior. And I don't see you, Kimberly, but I know you're here.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So yeah, hi everyone. This has been really great. I've been enjoying the conversation. So my name is Kimberly Bennett. I'm the founder of K-Bennett Law as well as the founder of Atlanta Legal Tech, which is although started as a meetup community and based in Atlanta, is now not just Atlanta based, but that's where we started, where our initial goal was to just drive, not the only goal, but the forward-facing goal was to drive the adoption of technology with legal professionals, legal teams, right? Those of us that are practicing or helping those that practice. And we always felt from the very beginning that that conversation shouldn't just be a conversation that lawyers had or only about lawyers, that it should be an inclusive conversation of those that are utilizing our services, helping create the technology, those that are actually, that are practicing. And so we started there. COVID happened, and I think no matter what we said, I think COVID did a much better job of telling people, hey, you needed to make a change. And as we were continuing, always a part of our conversations were inclusion and even anti-racism. And I think like this time last year, this conference was happening the day before our in-person conference too. So we've run an in-person conference as well, which was focused on getting stuff done. Like this is on the innovation and thinking through it. Then we're like, okay, now that we're thinking through it, how do we actually apply it right now? And so fast forward with everything that's happening with COVID, and as a founder, I have been always involved in the BLM movement for years, right? I was the lawyer that was protesting. I was the lawyer that saw people I worked with, and while I was protesting, thinking, am I going to hear something about this later? And so I've always, and as a founder of my own firm, I think people have always said, well, I'm surprised that you say what you say, or if you see me on social, I'm very clear about my stance on things. And I think it's important that as legal professionals, we stop going down the gray line of like where things stand. So with Atlanta Legal Tech, as everything was happening, we were thinking, well, how do we continue to show up in the way that we do, even in our private lives, in this organization that we've built? And so with that, I wouldn't say shift, but kind of the evolution of Atlanta Legal Tech has moved to building an anti-racist legal system and supporting businesses that do that, right? And that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, but it really is, as we were just talking about, the importance of talking about anti-racism and what that means and how that shows up and what that impact is on all the other intersectional conversations that we can have and that we should be having. And so that's a little bit of our growth and kind of the perspective I take. And I think as legal professionals, we have a obligation to take a stance, particularly now in what's happening and just being here and listening to the stories. I mean, as a student over almost 15 years, more than that. As a student, I was actually a JD PhD student, and I left my PhD program because of a lack of support, right? And so you can see how those things play out in where we are today. And so I started law school 19 years ago, I was in law school, right? And 19 years later, we still have the same issues. And I think then that means there's a systemic problem, and that's what we're trying to address, the systemic structural problem. That is a legal system problem. It is, yes, it shows up in law school, yes, it shows up in our firms, yes, it shows up in academia, yes, it shows up, but it's a system-wide problem, then that impacts the communities that we serve. So that's what we talk about, that's what we are, and so this is an amazing conversation to be a part of.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I want to shift a little bit so we can also do some talk about how we can achieve resource equity. And Kristen had some really helpful pointers there. I was looking to see if Dorna was able to join us, and I don't see her yet. So I'm going to presume she's either late or maybe couldn't commit. But Nakia,
Yes.
you are seeing and doing, my friend, amazing work at Georgia Tech. You are hopefully not completely overwhelmed by this entire Legal Eagle day.
No, not at all.
But you are trying to help move the needle back to our technologists and inventors and young people who are doing some amazing stuff at Georgia Tech, and some of the young people at Morehouse and Spelman, which those are outside Atlanta. We're fortunate to have like a really amazing HBCU community here in Atlanta, in addition to some huge institutions within the metro area. Tell us about what's going on with resources for people of color who are starting businesses.
Yeah, that's thank you. And and I haven't been inundated. It's been good to hear all of what everyone is doing in their respective fields. And believe me, I've been taking a lot of notes, mental notes and physical notes on some things that I can implement in the spaces that I spend time in, because it is crazy, just to hear Kimberly say, okay, when she was in 19, 18 years ago, and we're still dealing with the same issues. It's like, okay, what are we really doing here? And how do we really fundamentally change that? And I view myself as that change agent, that disruptor. Like, I'm not here for you to like me. I'm here for you to respect and me to create a platform and a pathway for people who look like me. And in the process, if you so happen to like me, that's an extra bonus. But, I'm committed to the cause and committed to making sure that there is fairness, there is equity, especially in the tech space. Because we don't see it. There's a bunch of champions out there working really, really hard to make sure that there's equity for all. So I'll just talk about some of the things that I'm involved in, some of the things that are going on at ATDC, or the Advanced Technology Development Center. I have a couple of jobs on campus with ATDC. I do some stuff with CreateX, and I'm also part of the Minority Business Development Center with Donna Ennis and her group. As well, and the Innovation Enterprise Institute, which is their economic development lab, which they kind of have a global reach for Georgia Tech. So I'll start with one of the most recent projects that we're working on. We worked on a grant last year, several of us, for the MBDA Center, and we actually won that award. It was $1.5 million. And what we're going to be doing over the next 2 years is create this innovation hub throughout the Southeast. And this innovation hub is going to be solely to make sure that MBEs, minorities, Black and tech, scientists, researchers, engineers have access to resources and know who the players are, and also, not importantly, know how to navigate through these, all of these, like through SBIR, all of these things that we commonly talk about that are second nature to people who don't look like us, but are somewhat convoluted or need to be distilled a little bit for the minority trying to engage in some of these activities. And with that, and part of my role will be to coach them, to mentor them, to help them navigate the program, to help grow their business, scale their business, to get them in a position to be fundable, to be investable, and to get them to move them from an ideation stage to a growth to a commercialization stage. And so that innovation hub is going, Georgia Tech is the primary award or grantee of that, but we're also partnering with Morehouse. They're a part of that as well. We've got other universities throughout the Southeast, HBCUs, that we're pulling in to this innovation hub as well. So that is, for me, is going to be one of the things that's going to be a fundamental game changer. Because I spent a lot of time in these deep tech spaces, and I can tell you this, I can count on maybe half of one finger how many people I see that physically look like me in these spaces. And I know that there are tons of engineers and scientists and researchers that look like me that are doing amazing work. And oftentimes their focus is just, okay, I get this physical degree and then I'll go work for someone. The thought is never, why am I not going to be the next Pfizer or the next Amgen? Why can I not take a product or build a company in that capacity? And oftentimes the thing that we're talking about is a lack of resources or understanding on how to physically do those things. And so I facilitate a lot of that through the National Science Foundation, where I am an instructor and a mentor, and I also do some reviewing for some of their proposals as well. So I spend a lot of time in these spaces looking at researchers. And the thing that I hear the most is, how do you get to second and third and fourth year in your PhD program? And I throw a name like GFRP out, Graduate Fellowship Research Program, through the NSF, and they say, well, I never heard of that. Well, why, as you as a minority haven't heard of that? That's money that they will give you to go to graduate school to figure out your research, to help foster STEM education and to move you along, whether it be research or building a business. And so I spent a lot of time trying to connect the dots for a lot of these researchers and a lot of the dots for minorities and Latinx and women that are in these spaces that don't necessarily get access to the things that I see on a day-to-day basis. And with these programs, and there's another program that I'm very actively involved with that Morehouse just started, which I think is going to be a game changer, as well as called Bridges to Biotechnology and Bio-Entrepreneurship. And it is a pipeline program that Morehouse has created, which is designed to take minorities that are in the STEM field, life science, biotech field, and then move them through a process, give them some entrepreneurship training with scientific training, and then move them into a biotechnology degree through Morehouse, and then connect them with possible industry. So this is a great pipeline, because when you look at, it's less than 1% of the minorities that are in the biotech, life science, therapeutic, medical device space that represent us, that are truly building game-changing, novel type technologies. And I know they exist because I see them through VentureWell and all these other organizations that I participate in. And so that's my role. My job is to be that champion, to be that voice, to give them the information and not just give it to them, but like, here's the actual pathway to walk through. This is how you take advantage of this. This is how you utilize this. And I don't understand how so you have a researcher who's a PhD but don't know how to write a grant. Okay, this is how we write a grant. This is how you pursue grant funding. This is how you pursue a federal laboratory. So there's so much work that needs to be done. So I spend hours on hours on hours per end just spending time making sure that I translate all of this resources that are out there for them to say, here's how you can take advantage of that and assimilate that into your environment. And I love being at ATDC because John, who's the director there, has been, absolutely amazing and giving me the platform and allowing me the opportunity to create these pathways and to create these programming for minorities and to make sure that we're being inclusive. He was very intentional about that whole process. And one last other thing, and then I'll shut up and let someone else come.
No, you're good.
And so, and with that, I've also created some new programming at ATDC. The two programs are called Scale Up Lab and Mentor Studio. What Scale Up Lab is designed for the researcher, the engineer, the scientist. It is a true ideation to commercialization curriculum that I've created. It's a 6-month program, and it walks them through everything from how to translate it from the lab to commercialization. And in that is how to write an SBIR. In that is also making sure how to write a commercialization plan. It's how to navigate all of, whether it's FDA, all of those things, how to build business models, how to make sure that you're primed for investment. I tell a lot of our researchers, I know that the word is always go get VC funding, go get VC funding. I'm like, no, hold on, let's pump the brakes for a second. You guys are smart, you're researchers, you're engineers. there is non-dilutive funding that you guys can get the opportunity to take full advantage of first before you start going down that Gambino crime family Shark Tank route, and setting yourself up. So, so I'm full passion about this entire process. And there's just a couple of resources that I think that I'm going to drop here. And if you can remember to drop in the chat that I think that every minority needs to understand, which is the Nsf Gfrp Program, which, the applications, if you, for 5-year fellowship program, 3 years of financial support, and an annual stipend of $34,000. And then you get an allowance for $12,000 to your institution. And then there's VentureWell, where they have tons of E-team faculty grants, research grants, in dollar amounts from $50,000 to $100,000, depending on what you're working on. So that is something that you definitely need to take advantage of. And for those who are thinking about actually starting a company, of course, there is SBIR, which is sbir.gov. And if you want to know more about that, you can go to seedfund.nsf.gov, which is also another great resource. And then we have what is called also the Partnership for Innovation, which is the PFI grant, which is a congressional mandate goals to help accelerate and translate research. And they have 2 types of funding. One is the PFI, which is a grant up to $250,000 from 18 to 24 months for applied research, proof of concept demonstration. With that, they do ask that you go through the Nsf Gfrp Program in relationship for that, or they have also what is called the Pfi Rp Grant, which is up to $550,000 for over 36 months. It operates the same as the PFI grant, but it's focused on multidisciplinary, multi-organizational teams required, but you also have to have an industry partner. So if you're that researcher and you're not quite sure, am I ready to start a business? The PFI funding is something that can give you the opportunity to work with industry while still being a researcher, and being able to build a business. And so these are some resources that are commonly taken advantage of that I think that minorities are so underrepresented in these specific areas.
Woo! It was like a speed round. You just, we literally have 2 minutes left. I dropped as many links in the chat as I could find and keep up with. But oh my God, Nakias, this is why I had to have him at this conference, y'all. Because I was like, if there's one person who I know, I can say, how do I find the money? Show me the money. I'm gonna give you Jerry Maguire. Yes, it's still being recorded. So thank you for sharing that. Some of those programs, though, Nakia, are for students, grad or undergrad, but through SBIR and maybe through NSF, are there funds for small businesses? I know SBIR, yes.
Yes.
But okay, because not. I frequently get folks who, after they graduate, are now trying to get that gap funding, right? So you're right, not the VC money, but I just need money to build a prototype. Tiger students who are trying to just get to proof of concept or really flush out their value proposition and need resources. They need money to do that, and can't close the needle on that. This has been phenomenal. I knew this would happen at 2:00, that there would be this wind up and then this sudden crash. I have a hard stop because I got to teach Olani and some others at 2:30. But I do want to open up if anyone has any closing comments or things they wanted to share, didn't have a chance to say, or anything in the last 60 seconds, 90 seconds.
Just thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, Gwilym. Thank you, Kimberly. Holy smokes. Thank you, Greg, for your great questions. Thank you, Yenny, for your great questions as a student. Thank you, the faculty at Emory, who were super supportive and in the chat and sharing out. We will send the recording, probably push it through Teams because that's the easiest way to get it to everybody at one time. And stay tuned for more exciting information from the Tiger team, Tiger program. We'll get a band of misfits together again to do some good, to get into good trouble, as John Lewis said, right? So thank you guys.
Thank you, Nicole. Fabulous job.
Thank you guys. Stay safe, be well.
Bye
And we'll
bye.
see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Are you ready for me to stop recording?
Please stop recording. Yes, if you
Okay.
have control of that.
Okay, I'm pushing that button.
Excellent.